West Coast rainforests. For some, they represent livelihoods, communities, and a way of life. To others, they represent the grandeur of nature and the sacredness of an untouched wilderness. And for many of us, they represent both, vital human resources and wild natural cathedrals. But in British Columbia, we're facing two converging crises in our forests. On the one side, we've got a handful of timber companies that are on track to liquidate the last old-growth temperate rainforests on the West Coast.
I mean, it's like shooting the last panda bears or slaughtering the last blue whales or rhinoceroses. There's no room for that anymore.
Meanwhile, the industry is extracting staggering volumes of young timber, using highly mechanized practices and exporting raw logs overseas in record numbers. This has coincided with a wave of mill closures and the loss of thousands of forestry jobs.
The wood of BC should generate economy for BC and jobs.
But in response to this, there's an increasingly diverse coalition forming around a growing consensus that the way we do forestry in BC is in need of a radical change, and that the only way forward is to shift to a sustainable, second growth, value-added forestry model.
So one of the most interesting things about our forests is that we have the largest standing biomass on Earth. So more carbon standing per hectare than any other ecosystem in the world because we have such big trees. But they actually have the shallowest soil of any other forested ecosystem in the world because the trees hold each other up.
Coastal British Columbia is home to some of the last ancient temperate rainforest on the planet. And while BC's north coast is still largely intact and enjoys more stringent regulations, Vancouver Island is another story.
Looking at Vancouver Island, we have these highly endangered big tree ecosystems that have this very high biomass and carbon storage with many species that don't exist anywhere else. But there's a bad news story because there's so little old growth left.
And one of the things with these old forests is the richness is beneath our feet, and there's all of these kind of fungal and bacterial processes going on down there, many of which we don't even really understand.
But these forests have been home to more than just birds and bears. For 10,000 years since the last ice age, coastal First Nations have responsibly stewarded these forests, using the wood, bark, and plants for their longhouses, canoes, tools, food, and medicines.
See, this log brought us life. It's just not just used for making money. It's so valuable, eh?
But in the span of just 150 years, these once sprawling forests have been reduced to tattered fragments. And perhaps no people have been more impacted by this loss of old growth than the Hulkaminam nations of southeastern Vancouver Island.
Eventually, they must have clear-cut the whole territory because there's no old growth trees left. And if you look at a map, you will see that, in other parts of Vancouver Island, they still have old growth forests. On the east coast of Vancouver, there's absolutely no old growth forests.
Let's rewind the clock to 1867. Vancouver Island used to be coated with ancient forests from valley bottom to mountaintop. Today, less than 25% of the original forest is still standing. When you look at just the valley bottoms where the biggest and most valuable trees grow, less than 10% remains. And when you look at just the coastal Douglas fir bioregion on southeastern Vancouver Island, less than 1% of the original forest remains.
And the industrial model of logging in Canada has been to completely eliminate the existing really diverse old growth ecosystem and replace it with a monoculture system that is much like a farm. And as you walk into a second growth forest versus an old growth forest, you can literally see the difference in how lush these ecosystems are.
This is a pocket of old growth on Cortez Island. Notice how it's got a diversity of tree species and age classes. It's got an open canopy that allows light to hit the forest floor and a lush, spacious understory that provides lots of food for deer, which themselves become food for wolves and cougar. It's a thriving ecosystem that's taken millennia to develop. It's a pretty typical young plantation forest. The trees are largely the same age and species, and they're really densely planted, so very little light can get through to the forest floor, meaning these forests support very little wildlife. They may look like healthy green forests as you drive past them on the highway, but in reality, they're like ecological deserts.
The medicines are gone because they just simply can't survive any longer. The cedar trees are gone. They don't even exist hardly in our territory now. You know, how can you teach your children how to build a canoe out of these big cedar trees when they're no longer cedar trees?
Forests have been dubbed the renewable resource, but ancient forests support more biodiversity, store more carbon, and retain far more water than second growth forests do. So replacing this with this is not a fair deal. Not to mention that these forests aren't going to be left for 1,000 years to return to their former glory. These trees were planted to be logged again in 50 to 80 years, not nearly long enough for these ecosystems to recover.
That's not sustainable. That's mining, that's not putting anything back. So we feel that that's a real backward way of running an economy, and it's a terrible way of running an ecology.
One way or another, old growth logging is going to end. Whether that's by choice or because we lose these forests forever is up to us. Hey guys, thanks for watching part 1 of the Heartwood documentary series. I hope you enjoyed it. And here's a little preview of part 2, which will be out in the next couple of days. No one can deny that this industry has been essential to rural communities in British Columbia.
That industry helped me raise my kids, put food on the table, paid the rent.
But when it comes to employment, the industry is a shadow of its former self.
We've seen a huge number of sawmills close. We've seen job numbers plummet.
We took the quick money, resource liquidation, selling raw logs, and now we're paying the price for that.
And the economic well-being of the community, in my mind, trumps the big companies' financial interests every time. It's our wood. We own that wood.